morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Friedman. I'm the director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. Welcome today to the next installment of season 3 of Coffee and Conversations, discussing contemporary issues with Miami Book Fair. We first began this webinar at the start of the coronavirus pandemic and quarantine, now a lifetime away, in order to understand how cultural institutions were handling the changes before us at that time. It seemed to us that the responsibility and power of cultural institutions had and has never been more poignant. So we turned to the longstanding pandemic of racism and anti-Blackness in this country in season 2, Cultural Institutions and Histories of Anti-Blackness. And today, as we continue to engage in conversations about arts and culture in this moment, we find ourselves in season 3, a collaboration with Miami Book Fair. This collaboration involves several of the most well-known thinkers living and writing today, all of whom will be participating in the 37th Miami Book Fair between November 15th and 22nd, 2020. To top it off, today's season 3 guest, Deborah Paredez, author of newly released Year of the Dog, joins us. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Deborah is a poet and interdisciplinary performance scholar whose lectures and publications examine Black and Latinx popular culture, poetry of war and witness, feminist elegy, cultural memory, and the role of divas in American culture. She's the author of the award-winning critical study, Salinidad, Selena, Latinos, and the Performance of Memory, and the poetry collections, This Side of Skin, and now Year of the Dog. Her poetry and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, National Public Radio, Boston Review, Poetry, Feminist Studies, and on and on. Her research and writing have been supported by numerous centers and foundations and organizations, too many to list here if we want time to talk. So saying that we are honored to have her is an understatement. And she is joined by our wonderful colleague, Nathaniel Cadle, who is among our WPHL Public Humanities Faculty Fellows and Associate Professor in the Department of English at FIU. He's author of Mediating Nation, Late American Realism, Globalization, and the Progressive State. So very briefly, our format is simple. The two of our wonderful guests will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we take questions from the audience for the remaining 10. So at any time, you can submit a question using the Q&A chat button at the bottom of the screen. And with that, I leave it to our wonderful guests, please.
Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks, Deborah, for being here. We've often started these coffee and conversations with questions related to the work that we do during the pandemic, but I kind of wanted to get there because I think that your book is actually about a very specific time and place. So for the audience, I was wondering if you'd just say a little bit about what the Year of the Dog is, both the collection and the year itself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Nathaniel. I'm so happy to be here. Year of the Dog is a collection of poetry, first and foremost, but it is also, in some ways, an attempt to document both a particular historical period, but to also speak to the ongoing disasters, right, that we have found ourselves in, certainly during the 50 years of my lifetime. And Year of the Dog in particular, the title refers to two different things. One, the year of the metal dog, the year 1970, which was the year I was born, so you know how old I am, and the year of my father's, as he was preparing for deployment after being drafted into the war in Vietnam, like many other Latino immigrants and Mexican Americans, as he is a Mexican immigrant. And it is also referring, so in some ways, it's very much about a particular time and place. Like many of the poems in the book center in and around 1970 and document, in particular, the kind of the lasting after effects after my father returned home from Vietnam. But the title also refers to something a bit more mythic, and it hopes to evoke the story of Hecuba, who, if we remember in Greek mythology, she was the queen of Troy. And after the Greeks won the Trojan War, they were gathering up the women who were left to take them back as captives and slaves to the Greeks. And Hecuba, who had lost everyone and everything, was so upset and so outraged by the horrors of war that she howled and she howled. And as she was on the ship going back to Greece as a captive, she howled so much that she transformed into a dog and leapt off the ship from captivity and spent her days out at sea in an island howling and howling for the rest of her days. And so in many ways, she represents for me, and I think for many, this symbol of a woman who will not let go of her outrage in the face of the horrors of war and violence. And for me then speaks to what it means to sort of enact, you know, an elegy, especially from a woman who is often deemed to be the enemy or othered in some way. So the book takes part in both a historical memorialization, but also thinks about what it might mean to join this tradition of feminist outcries against war and disaster.
Yeah. One of the things that I was struck by reading it was how ambitious it is and in intricacy, really. But I guess the question I have is, at what point did you kind of realize that the poetry you were writing was going to create this kind of narrative? I know that a lot of the poems appeared elsewhere in Poetry Magazine and elsewhere. So when did it all sort of seem to be coming together for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that you know, as you said, the poems have been written over a long period of time. And, you know, in many ways, you know, I started writing poetry when I was 12 years old. And I was aware that there was a huge silence in our house, right, around, and I knew intuitively that it had to do with the war, right, that there was, the war was sort of ever present, Vietnam War was ever present in our household and yet never spoken about, like for many households of veterans or refugees from war. This is a common occurrence. And so I remember when I was young, sneaking into my father's room and pulling down a photo album he had of snapshots he had taken in Vietnam and poring over those photos as if they would somehow unlock a story for me. You know, I was sort of furtive in the way that I guess some kids might do that with Playboy magazine, but I was like looking at war photography. And so tells you a little bit about me. And so I think that in some ways, I've been writing this book for so long, right? Because, you know, the book includes some of the pieces of his own photographic archive up against iconic photos from the period. But as I was finally deciding to finish the book, you know, I had struggled for many years saying, I want to be done with Vietnam. I want to be done with this kind of thing. And I think once I surrendered to saying, look, I have to write this book, that was part of it. But when I was actually finishing it, it was in the spring of 2018, which happened to also be a year of the dog, I realized as I was writing. But also, I think most importantly for the project, by May of 2018, when I finished the book, the US had already reported that in 2018, it was the year that had reported the highest numbers of school shootings in the nation's history. And for me, the recognition of that moment in which I was writing and this kind of continuity, both in not just in the year of the dog, but in this ongoing war and violence, especially among vulnerable communities and communities of color. At that moment, it sort of made me think, look, this is a book just as much about our ongoing and endless war on the domestic front in particular, as it is about a particular moment.
Yeah, and there are moments, I think, particularly in the last third of the book, where you draw direct parallels between the events surrounding 1970, Fred Hampton's killing, and then later on, you have a poem that parallels his killing with Eric Gardner's. And so I think that that's maybe what's leading me to the typical question that we ask in these conversations is, to what degree do you think the collection speaks to our current moment? I mean, you're clearly talking about issues like Black Lives Matter, women's bodies, and how they're perceived and mediated and so forth. But would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Sure. You know, the Eric Garner case, I think in particular, was very resonant for me because the lack of the indictment, right, was announced pretty much 40, you know, years or so, 40 something years after Fred Hampton, on the sort of around that day of Fred Hampton's murder. And so that was a kind of very concrete, a kind of resonance, right, that happened, that we are in fact still, you know, in this ongoing terrorism against, you know, Black men, certainly, but Black communities. You know, for me, I feel like I felt the sense of a disaster already before we entered the pandemic, precisely because I did see that, you know, even in my own family, you know, the military became a place that was the economic, you know, kind of possibility for them, even throughout the Gulf War. You know, I saw that very much amongst my cousins, and in Afghanistan, you know, through the war on terror, that this was still something very much a part of our lives. And I also felt like in the years even after 9/11 that there was still not the space, there was never the space to grieve, right? And we are certainly in that moment now. There's never have been a space that was sort of sanctioned to grieve. It was either buy stuff, right? Especially having lived in New York, like your response is to be a consumer, or your response is to deny it entirely, right? As I feel like we're in this moment now. And so I had no idea, though, I had written these poems, that it would then appear in a moment of such you know, acute a disaster in a different way. But I think that it just speaks to how, and how women and women of color, if we think about the founding of Black Lives Matter by 3, you know, feminists of color, that women and women of color in particular have been at the forefront for so long at bringing about, you know, screaming out against injustice and attempting to bring about social change. So I think those resonances are certainly ones that I noticed, and many of which appear in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading the book is the way that you interweave so many different things. So, I mean, it's hard to communicate it to the audience if they don't have the book in front of them. But not only are you interweaving the past and the present and historical events as well as personal events, but you have images from your father's photographs interspersed periodically. So there's the text and the imagery. I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking. It's an interesting approach to the book.
Absolutely. You know, it's so interesting. There was a review that just came out, which was very lovely, that was talking about like, well, you know, some might say it doesn't cohere because it's so ambitious, and that perhaps coherence isn't the aim, which I thought was very generous. But I also believe that it is true. Like I wanted something to be epic, you know, and that our communities deserve an epic treatment. And yet it also means that, but I also wanted there to be this sense of fragmentation, right? Not only because the bodies, you know, not only because the communities that we live in have been torn asunder so much and continue to be, but also because I wanted to sort of, you know, really go against a kind of narrative or sort of simple, you know, chronology, and have things be kind of blasted apart, and have that be the both aesthetics and politics, right, of the book, so that you know, that there are the kinds of ways in which we've often made coherent sense of these things. I wanted that to be troubled. And so you mentioned the photographs in the book. With Vietnam in particular, as many of us recall, you know, it was the war that that was in some ways the most photographically documented, right? And so that we have, and certainly in my lifetime, come to know that war through the photographic documentation, whether it's the photo of Kent State by John Philo, whether it's about, you know, Nick Ute's photo of Kim Phuc burned by napalm. There are these photos that live on in our consciousness. And so in some ways it's this hyper documented moment that very much changed, right, in the wars since then, when embedded photography became the way so that they could control the narratives. But even as much as it's so over-documented or hyper-documented, Latino communities in particular have been completely under-documented by that war. You know, I wrote this in the midst of Kim Burns's series. It was sort of happening when I was finishing the book. And even in that, I felt like, you know, for Black and Latino communities, certainly there is this sense of eluding, you know, the documentation. And for Latinos in particular, Latinx communities, I think it's really interesting in regards to thinking about Vietnam, because during the war, they were classified racially as white. So what this means is they actually aren't even in the documentation, right? Like to find them, I think scholars and researchers have done very creative things like searched by Spanish surname, which is great, but doesn't often account for other kinds of things. And so what happens is we elude documentation. We're also overdetermined by documentation. Like, are you documented? Do you have your papers? So I wanted to engage in the idea of I wanted to question the very notion of documentation, especially with regards to Latinx communities.
Yeah, yeah, and you actually, like, you make the factual data, the historical research that you've done, very obvious. There are footnotes. Edgewood Elegy, which is basically just sort of like the factual data that you've collected about the Latino men. And I think, are there any women, or was it primarily?
It was men. In that particular instance, it was all men. Mm-hmm. Yes, you know, I wanted to, just as much as I wanted to amass and sort of convey through poetry, you know, all of this research. I wanted to, and especially with the case of Edgewood Elegy, which is an elegy to the high school class of, from the Edgewood school district in San Antonio, which is on the west side of San Antonio, predominantly poor and working class Latinx communities, was the second highest school district that suffered the second highest number of casualties in Vietnam. My father went to school in that school district. The highest number of, the school district that has the highest number, of course, is one that's predominantly Black. And so we see, you know, in the numbers, right, what we, you know, what they bear out, which is that the deaths and the, you know, were overrepresented by Black and brown bodies, by Black and brown soldiers. And so I think that I wanted to also show that even as we know what we do know, there's still so many there's still so much white negative space, right, on those pages, like using poetry to use the kind of blank and the absence to show also, as much as I tried to retrieve, there's so much that's irretrievable, and wanting that to also stand. And having that approach to the images, right, because I reproduce some iconic images like the ones I mentioned, but I reproduce fragments of them. And I put those fragments up against fragments of my father's own private archive as a way to trouble, again, that coherent narrative that we have. So like if we actually fragmented, what might be possible, right? Or what silences might we sort of show?
You've kindly volunteered to read a poem or two. Is there one based on the things that we've been talking about? I mean, it's hard to illustrate that kind of interweaving, but if there's one that you have in mind that illustrates just this.
Absolutely. You know, there's, I can read one. There's what I've done. I think this idea of trying to make us rethink the everyday, whether it's the everyday image or everyday language. Part of how I also do that in the book is through these idiom poems. I write poems that just as I want us to kind of look anew at some of these iconic images, right? And to reacquaint ourselves with the horror there, because we can become inured to our horror, right? By the fact that they kind of get proliferated. And I wanted to show how that happens in language as well. And so I thought, what's the most like banal and everyday form of language? It's the idiom, right? And what if we like look at idioms and kind of estrange ourselves from them? And I wanted to focus, so I wanted to do that to show kind of what violence lives in our everyday language, what sort of, so I look at idioms that reference parts of the body. So this one is one that I think perhaps does some of what we've been talking about. It's early in the book, and it's called A Show of Hands. My father taught me never to show my hand. Always play the hand you're dealt. Don't bite the hand that feeds. You gotta hand it to him. He lived his life hand to mouth. Even before Nam, he knew close only counts in horseshoes, and hand grenades go hand to hand combat. Idle hands are the devil's. Play into the enemy's, hand it over, and out of his hands, ringing a bird in hand, is worth two. In the bush, he wasn't so good with his hands, took his life into his own blood on his hands, on the one hand and on the other.
Thank you.
You're
That's
welcome.
great.
I think that, you know, there's poems about hands and there's poems about tongues and faces. And, I wanted the book, again, to speak against coherence, or to speak about ambition, to really, in some ways, perform how the body is torn asunder, and have those body parts literally and figuratively kind of be spread throughout the book, without also trying to re-stage the violence, right? I think that's also a tricky thing, especially when dealing with images. And so it was important for me not to just reproduce wholesale images or language of violence, but to try to suggest it and interrogate it. And again, reawaken in us that sense of horror to the things that we've kind of taken in as everyday, that, we can just, it's a Tuesday, right? And feel like, right, this is just something, I think, especially given how in our current moment, the dead are piled so high around us every day. And it is so easy to have become inured, especially when the national narrative is about denial, is about refusing grief. I feel even more strongly than I ever have about like the insistence on like, no, let's just be irrationally loud and howling because because that is the only, precisely because it's being denied.
Actually, so I have a really, it's a hyper-specific question, and I hope it doesn't give anything away, because, you know, again, like I said, there's a sense of narrative that comes through. Often whenever I'm reading collections of poetry, I sometimes skip around or bounce around, but this is one I read sequentially. And it's the last poem. And I'm wondering, you know, it ends with a kind of intergenerational creation of Howley. And I'm wondering, is that a hopeful poem to end on? A bleak poem to end on? I mean, how do you feel about that?
Sure. So I just want to make sure, are you referring to Self-Portrait in the Time of Disaster, or the very last image poem?
I was thinking of Self-Portrait in Time of
Okay, that's what I thought. I just want to make sure. So so Self-Portrait in the Time of Disaster, should I read it and then or talk about it, or which do you prefer? I'm happy to do either, depending on time.
Read it.
Okay, so the first poem in the book is a poem that's it's about the moment of my birth. So it talks about me and relation to my grandmother and my mother and Hecuba. So there's a very clear genealogy I'm putting forward. And then the book ends with this poem, again, that I didn't realize would have so much resonance in this moment, but was written, as you can tell, from when my daughter was much younger than she is now. Self-Portrait in the Time of Disaster. All morning, my daughter pleading, outside, outside. By noon, I kneel to button her coat, tie the scarf to keep her hood in place. This is her first snow, so she strains against the ritual, spooked silent, then whining, restless under each buffeting layer, uncertain how to settle into this leashing. I manage at last to tunnel her hands into mittens, and she barks, and she won't stop barking. Her hands to her now suddenly pause. She's reduced to another state, barking all day in these restraints. For days after, she howls into her hands, the only way she knows now to tell me how she wants out. You know, so that poem, I feel like, you know, it was funny because that poem wasn't going to be in the book. It was going to be in another book. And a friend of mine was like, oh yeah, and then you have that dog poem about your kid. And I'm like, oh my gosh, dogs are everywhere in my work. The howling dog, the woman, you know, the girl child who turns into the woman who howls like a dog. And so I think it's like, again, sometimes the work is, or if you do it right, I guess the work is smarter than you. But I think that for me, that poem was a way or I attempted to try to show this sense of the ongoing disaster, certainly, right, and on some obvious ways. A sense of also acknowledging or trying to cultivate in the next generation that sense that, right, absolutely, sometimes we have to transform ourselves even beyond what we think of as human to have our needs met, right, to acknowledge our desires or our needs. I guess if there's hope in it, it's that there is the sense of a passing on of that particular survival strategy, I guess. It's funny because I have a colleague who said, oh, that's a really hopeful poem. And I said, really? I think of it as like, here we are again, we're just back at the beginning. So I think that there are resonances of both. I think that particular, that particular cultivating of the girl child as the, you know, Hecuba to be, is in the one hand about a kind of feminist elegy legacy of feminist elegy. And on the other hand, I think it's also about, damn, we're here still again and again and again.
Maybe it's about the way in which we conceive of the place into which she is going.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right.
So the hopeful or the opposite of that.
Yeah, exactly. You know, as I think that their Generation Z, I guess it is very acutely aware of, you know, they're sort of like, yeah, it is the apocalypse. I mean, it's been very interesting as I teach students as well, like, yes, it is the apocalypse, and as opposed to, oh, well, which I think is distinct from maybe the way some of us feel.
That's interesting. I was going to actually ask you, if I may, about teaching in these days and what that experience has been like for you.
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting when I think about the spring, back in the spring when we moved all the courses online, and especially being here in New York City where there was so much fear and grief and rage. The seniors I had that graduated that last fall, I realized had been freshmen during the 2016 election. So I had some of them when they voted for the first time, some of them, when they, I picked a student up outside of the classroom in 2016 and kind of helped carry them in, like it was, so I feel like, wow, they have shown me how and yet many of these graduates who did this beautiful graduation ceremony online were the ones who were like, they're just like, it's a Tuesday, let's fight.
Right.
And I think that there is a real inspiration that I find in so many of them as they certainly struggle in understanding, I think in really accepting and seeing very clearly how vast the catastrophe is and thinking that can't immobilize me. And I think that's been part of it. I think the students, are understandably feeling desperate for a sense of connection, right? And are trying to figure out, I think, also ways to engage online, because so many of us are online now, that aren't the ways they've been conditioned to, like by Twitter, by Facebook, by social media. And I think that's been interesting to see as well. But mostly I find them to be like, I teach a class right now called Documenting Disaster, in which we look at a range of historical disasters, and then the students are going to be sort of documenting this current moment and others. And they are just like, yep, here we go. And they're not shying away from it. At least the ones I have. I mean, it's self-selecting of obviously crowd if they're going to take this class. But I do feel like they are up for it.
I mean, that's very hopeful.
Yeah.
Very hopeful message. Yeah. Do you think they turn to art and poetry as part of their kind of conceiving of how to confront the apocalypse?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think precisely because we're living in a moment when facts are completely disregarded, regularly disregarded. So where do you go if if the facts are unreliable, where do you go for the truths? And you go to art, right? And whether it's poetry, whether it's, the visual arts, whether it's, movement of some kind, I think that they are recognizing, and in fact, I think also, so in times when the grief is so overwhelming or the rage is so overwhelming, this can be a language in which it can be spoken, or a container in which it can be held beyond the kind of coherent narrative, right? Or speech as we know it.
Yeah,
that's been my experience too. I'm teaching Henry James, and I'm kind of struck by how many of the students are kind of sticking with him.
Yeah.
Over the course of a long read.
Yeah, I do find that they are eager for that kind of deep engagement, whether it's because of distraction, whether it's because, the need for distraction, whether it's because the need of just, kind of being present with something that is either of the time, resonant with the time, or completely outside of this time, that there is a lot of that I'm noticing as well.
I mean, it satisfies the need for connection, as you suggested too, doesn't it?
And and why wouldn't it, right? And when social distancing is the sort of term of the year, how do we find that sense of proximity and intimacy? And I think it's often through art and through the deep study. I think through deep study, right? Whatever that is.
Certainly through your poetry.
Thank you.
Certainly through your poetry. So I might be stealing Nathaniel's thunder. I don't know if you have more questions to ask.
Well, I guess we're close to wrapping up. Is there a final poem you'd like to leave us with, Deborah?
Wow. Maybe I will read one. I'll read a poem that, if there's, yes, I have a poem that I think is kind of resonant, speaks to a kind of number of things, and it's called Year of the Dog, Walls and Mirrors. And so it's a poem from another Year of the Dog, the year 1982, which is when the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was being constructed. It's a poem both about this wall, but about much more. And it begins with an epigraph from Maya Lin, who was the designer of the memorial. And she writes, "The wall dematerializes as a form and allows the name to become the object," which of course, if we've seen the memorial, we know it's all about the names. "The English translation of my surname is Walls misspelled. The original S turned to its mirrored twin, the Z, the beginning of the sound for sleep. It's 1982 and I'm nearly 12, and the mirror is a disaster I learn to turn away from. The girl looking back, always looking to extract her pound of flesh. I had a simple impulse to cut into the earth," Maya Lin is writing, "as the mirrored wall of names she's made is arranged and laid against the riven hillside. I never looked at the memorial as a wall," she writes. but as an edge to the earth, an opened side. For a wall to become a mirror, it must not absorb or scatter too much light. For a girl to become the protagonist, she must sleep with the guy, or until he kisses her awake. Sometimes we know she's the fairest one of all because of the mirror on the wall. Sometimes she must scale the city's wall to bury the guy. Antigone cuts into the earth to give him his proper memorial. She ends up the heroine and buried alive, an in-between thing, like someone who's 11 or nearly 12. When I look at the number 11, I see two walls, my name and its mirrored twin. Sometimes 11 resembles the mirrored L's at the end of wall, or the beginning of llanto, the Spanish word for weeping. Sometimes 11 looks like a pair of railway sleepers arranged and laid along a track that's always leading me back to my war-worn father. Sometimes the guy comes back from battle and has seizures in his sleep, and the girl must shake him awake. Sometimes the wall and the name are one and the same. Sometimes the wall is where we end up to begin letting go our llanto.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So beautiful. I'm afraid we are at the end of our time with you today. So thank you so much, both of you. Thank you for joining us today and for this wonderful conversation. And thank you also to the audience for listening. And I have to make a small mention, which is the opening music. It's produced and performed by Simon Mogul, tenor saxophonist studying at the New School in New York City. And I want to ask the audience and everyone to join us on Tuesday. We'll be joined by Christian Stabler, author of Redbone, The True Story of a Native American Rock Band, who will be in conversation with our very own David Rifkind. And please mark your calendar and join us when Walter Mosley, Ilsa Calderon, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Abby Wambach, Joy Harago, Natalie Portman, Richard Ford, and many, many other thought leaders share their work at the 37th Miami Book Fair 2020, November 15th to 22nd. All readings, presentations, and conversations at the book fair will be free. So thank you again so much for being here. It was just such a pleasure to listen to you read and to learn more about your book. So thank you. And thank you, Nathaniel, for your wonderful questions. That's it. Everyone stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you both. What a great and pleasure and such a generous interview. Thank you.
Really
Thank you for being here.
Thank you both.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.